In the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy established USAID as a moral obligation and an economic imperative. Today, the world's richest man calls USAID a criminal organisation and money laundering scheme. And, as outspoken as he often is, he's not alone. From Washington to Westminster, Brussels to Berlin, leaders in the West are suddenly slashing their foreign aid budgets at unprecedented levels. The cuts save taxpayer cash and free up funds for defence and domestic development by sacrificing a spend deemed non-essential and luxurious. On the surface, this kinda makes sense. With so many people struggling to make ends meet in our own economies, sometimes we have to help ourselves before we can help others. But is it really a luxury? For nearly half a century, foreign aid has been arguably the West's most cost-effective tool to serve its own global interests, helping to secure alliances, win political favour, spread its ideological values, and maintain leverage. Aid hasn't been a story of generosity, aid has been a story of power. And this begs the question, as the world becomes less stable, is the West giving up this tool just when it might need it the most? So let's unpack the history, give context to the cuts, and explore why they could turn out to be a geopolitical blunder. Now before we continue, it's important to say that the recent cuts in foreign aid is a very controversial topic. We've spent countless hours doing research for this video because it's been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to avoid unbalanced media with hidden agendas. That's why we've been using ground news. Take the example of USAID being dramatically scaled down. Using ground news, I got a visual breakdown of which media organisations covered the story, what political leaning they had, and how factual their article actually was. This is supported by 3 independent news monitoring organisations. Not only did this make it easy to avoid factually inaccurate articles, it also meant that I could toggle between left-leaning and right-leaning articles. Left-leaning media highlighted the move as an unconstitutional shutdown, costing jobs and risking lives, whilst right-leaning media mainly portray the changes as a reform that enhances government efficiency whilst tackling fraud and abuse. The bias comparison tool is an easy way to check this. Having this easily accessible analysis means that I had a balanced and holistic perspective on the shutdown before I formed my own conclusions. This is obviously very useful for making these videos, but it's also great for newsreaders who want to know the full story and access different viewpoints, even if you don't agree with them. The Ground News app and website also have a ton of other features which make it a game changer for digesting news in an age of media distrust and information overload. Go to ground.news/context or use the QR code on screen to save 40% on the same unlimited access Vantage plan that we use to understand what's really happening in the world. Foreign aid is big business. The United States has for some time been the largest donor in absolute terms, contributing over $60 billion in official development assistance in 2023 alone, primarily directed towards economic development, humanitarian relief, global health, and security-related support. However, as a percentage of gross national income, European countries like Norway, Sweden, and Germany lead the way, exceeding the United Nations 0.7% target, whilst the US sat at 0.24%. Over the decades, this has amounted to trillions of dollars, consistently given away by both left-wing and right-wing governments across the West, even during times of domestic crises. But why? Well, it's not charity, not really. The British Empire was well known for its naval strength, which enabled them to claim new territories and subjects, but when using military force alone, its colonies were often tumultuous and unproductive. Aid was often used as a counterbalance to military force. The Colonial Development Act of 1929, also known as the Keep the Colonies from Rioting Fund, helped to build key infrastructure and fund technological advancements. This delivered immediate benefits to the colonies, served as a device to reinforce imperial rule by fostering goodwill and strengthening loyalty to the throne. The empire sought to portray itself as a benevolent power committed to the progress of its colonial subjects. Aid kept the colonies on side, subsidising any lingering animosity of foreign rule, labour exploitation, and lack of self-determination, which may develop into organised resistance as it did most famously in the American Revolution. So, if military force was the empire's stick, then foreign aid was the carrot. The Roman Empire also used foreign aid as a diplomatic tool, offering grain, money, and military support to client states in exchange for loyalty, influence, and control over key regions. Of course, these kinds of empires don't officially exist anymore, but using foreign aid to consolidate power still does. More times than not, offering aid is a cheap, cheerful, and far less messy approach to achieving foreign policy objectives than doing so by direct threat or force. Because real power comes from winning the hearts and minds of the people, and as the emerging superpower following World War II, the USA knew exactly that. The Marshall Plan, worth $175 billion in today's prices, rebuilt Europe and strengthened the US influence. Most dramatically, the Berlin airlift ensured that Ally-controlled West Berlin remained fed and supplied despite the USSR's blockade. This fostered a huge amount of goodwill, perhaps most adorably when American and British bombers dropped handkerchief parachutes of candy across the city for children of Berlin to cherish. As the Cold War between the US and the USSR spread worldwide, foreign aid became even more important as a tool of battle for ideological control, used by the USA to buy allies and export its central values of capitalism and democracy. This is the context in which USAID was born, established in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy to better coordinate the industrial scale of America's foreign aid and assistance programs. So, from its very birth, USAID had been a tool to project power, often complementing military intervention. For example, in 1969, USAID had 2,000 staff in its Vietnam Bureau, its largest mission at the height of the war. Mammoth quantities of aid also flowed into Iraq and Afghanistan following the US-led invasion in the early 2000s. By this point, foreign aid was cemented as a major cash flow in the global economy, with the dual motives of moral obligation to help those in need and a nationalist interest to use aid to influence foreign affairs. This was a delicate balancing act though, as obviously these motives do not always align. Sometimes foreign aid has controversially benefited donors more than recipients, mandating neoliberal reforms that haven't always led to positive outcomes. On top of this, foreign aid has become synonymous with corruption all across the system, with multi-billion-dollar contracts failing to deliver results and accusations of fraud widespread. And so, as the foreign aid budget in the US grew, so too did the criticism and scrutiny. Left-wing voices argue that foreign aid is just a new, sneakier version of colonialism, undermining governments of low-income countries, creating dependency, and preventing them from having true sovereignty. On the right, conservatives see foreign aid spending as ineffective, a waste of hard-earned taxpayer money, and a laundering scheme to help fund the woke liberal agenda. But on all sides of the political spectrum, foreign aid spending has been increasingly scrutinised as domestic socio-economic problems have grown and national security concerns return to the political foreground. And so, foreign aid lost favour, being seen as a wasteful or luxury spend which can be sacrificed. President Donald Trump took no time to act on his America First mandate, signing an executive order for a pause on USAID in his first day back in office. Elon Musk led the charge in gutting what he believes to be a criminal organisation. USAID's head office is now closed, with Wired reporting that the total workforce has fallen from 10,000 to just 3,000. 83% of USAID's contracts have been terminated as the State Department, the USA's other large foreign aid agency, takes control of the rest of the administration and its remaining contracts. But with the dramatic hyperbole of Trump and Musk lapping up global media coverage, you might have missed one thing. Foreign aid cuts are part of a much wider trend in the West. Across the pond, Keir Starmer announced the United Kingdom's largest cuts to its overseas aid in history, reducing the aid budget by 40% to create room in the budget for increased defence spending. Elsewhere in Europe, cuts in aid budgets have already begun. France slashed its foreign aid budget by 37%, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden and many others have also scaled back their commitments in recent years, citing domestic fiscal pressures and shifting political priorities. The cuts in the US have clearly been far more dramatic, but taken as a whole, Europe gives more overseas development assistance than the USA, meaning that recent cuts there are also very significant. This is a welcome move by many taxpayers who are concerned about growing public debt and have seen the failures of foreign interventions of recent decades. But slashing foreign aid isn't just about balancing budgets and appeasing taxpayers, it's a strategic choice with longer-term ramifications and the potential for numerous unintended consequences. And this begs the question, what are the risks of aid cuts from the West? Well, aid has helped to promote the USA as a fair and friendly global leader. As France and Britain gave up their global empires, so too did they use aid to build positive relations. This fostered reciprocal goodwill, won over fragile states, and strengthened global alliances. It also gave the West a moral credibility over rival authoritarian powers, who were often more transactional in their foreign aid disbursements. Don't get me wrong, the West hasn't always used aid in ways seen as morally correct. It's at times been used as a bargaining chip to access natural resources and cheap labour whilst cutting health and education budgets in poorer, less developed countries. Again, take the structural adjustment programs of the 1990s for example. But a lot of foreign aid from the West has been unquestionably altruistic. Take the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, for example. Initiated by Bush in 2003, it's been attributed to preventing millions of HIV infections and saving 25 million lives, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, all of this is to say the recent cuts are eroding the West's moral credibility in the world. Pulling back aid this quickly is going to cause more ill will than having never offered it in the first place. Obviously, this makes the West less popular, reducing reciprocal goodwill and potentially weakening alliances as global leaders in Africa, South America, the Middle East and Asia question whether the West is a reliable partner. Ultimately, this reduced soft power means that the West will be less able to tilt foreign affairs in its favour. Now, it's important to stress that in the long term, soured relations won't necessarily be the case with all countries, and that's because some leaders of developing countries are actually welcoming the cuts. Necessity is the mother of invention, and the dramatic scale back in aid is prompting governments to move away from aid dependency and towards financial independence. There's clearly a want for this. 2/3 of Africans want their countries to finance their national development from their own resources rather than rely on external loans. This is already happening to some extent. In Nigeria, for example, the government has already found an additional $200 million for public health spending now that they've lost $600 million in funding from the US. In Ethiopia, a new tax has been introduced to fill the gap. In due course, if aid-reliant countries become financially independent, then the narrative changes and these cuts would be seen as the pivotal kick-up-the-butt moment for aid-reliant countries, now unchanged from the neo-colonialist regime that aid truly was all along. If this is the long-term outcome, then it's possible that foreign aid cuts might lead to more amicable relationships between the West and its former aid recipients across the world. But the road to self-reliance is extremely bumpy and abundant with risks. And these risks could evolve into larger problems that eventually threaten the West in years to come. For instance, foreign aid has funded democratic initiatives all over the world, and as funding dries up, democratic institutions and free media become vulnerable, and weaker mechanisms of government accountability give space for authoritarianism to thrive as misinformation and propaganda undermine the democratic processes with little resistance. This is particularly an issue for former Soviet states in Eastern Europe, which Putin considers to be his sphere of influence. Now, the West could just continue to take a non-interventionist stance on this, but in the long term, these regimes could become hostile threats to national security. Of course, we're speculating far into the future here, but if this were to play out, then the foreign aid cuts would have been a costly mistake requiring more money to fix than it originally saved. It's not just Eastern Europe where Russia is looking to make gains though. In recent years, diplomatic ties between Russia and African nations have strengthened. Russia is the largest weapons supplier to the continent, it's the primary security partner of the newly formed alliance of Sahel states, it's building a naval base on Sudan's Red Sea coastline, and its secretive paramilitary group Wagner has economic, political and military ties all across the continent. Cuts in Western aid present an opportunity for Russia to become an even more central figure in African security and politics, which may win its support on global issues and voting power in the UN. Of course, the other superpower to consider in all of this is China, which already has strong diplomatic ties and assistance programs in many regions. With the assistance vacuum that's likely to emerge from the withdrawal in Western aid, China is well placed to fill the void and gain from this opportunity by increasing its influence, leverage and partnerships across the world, especially in Asia. This is already playing out. After the devastating earthquake that hit Myanmar in March, the US response was by all accounts delayed and chaotic. Staff were literally laid off while supporting the rescue and recovery efforts. In contrast, China was days ahead, driving the recovery efforts with boots on the ground and key supplies. China didn't just respond faster, it pledged over $130 million, which dwarfed the US's $9 million. China's filling US aid gaps elsewhere too. In Cambodia, the government was pleased to hear China's $4.4 million grant for demining efforts after USAID's demining program was suspended, and in sub-Saharan Africa, China's steady presence and commitment has been symbolically demonstrated by the tours of its hospital boat treating ill African citizens. It's no surprise then that a recent survey of over 5,000 young Africans showed that China is becoming more popular, whilst the US is becoming less popular. With this growing soft power, China can advance its national interests. For example, it could use aid to push its Taiwan or South China Sea agenda, it could use aid to gain voting power in international bodies. It's widely believed that China cannot and will not replace US aid entirely, but it may fill the most strategically important cracks. And so, the West might wake up to find they've lost influence and soft power when they really need it, simply because they were busy at home counting their pennies. This might not be such an issue now, but strong alliances, foreign influence, and shared values are a critical insurance measure to future-proof national security against rival powers, instability, and conflict. And the cherry on top of all of these geopolitical risks are global health concerns. The tracking, treatment, and contamination of infectious diseases in low-income countries is heavily dependent on USAID. Programs that provide these services are already scaling back, and experts assure that the risks of disease outbreaks and global pandemics have risen significantly. That would, obviously, negatively affect everyone, including the West. Look, the growing scrutiny of USAID in recent years has been justified. It's pumped billions of dollars into failed projects and enriched huge multinational contractors without proof of tangible results, and been embroiled in a constant flow of controversies. The agency was in clear need of reform, but foreign aid made up about 1% of the US federal budget. Cutting this isn't going to swing the pendulum of national debt or bring tangible relief to taxpayers. And for this low cost, it's been a pretty effective tool for advancing US interests abroad by harbouring stability, fostering diplomatic relations, promoting democracy, and winning political favour. This has benefited the US in a way that military force simply cannot replace, a spend that takes up over 10 times as much of the federal budget. By laying off 97% of USAID staff, it could be the case that the US government has thrown the baby out with the bathwater on this one. That said, US foreign aid isn't ending completely. USAID will probably continue, just in a much smaller way, and the State Department, which distributes a lot of the total aid budget, lives on. Aid from Europe also still exists. The difference now is that that aid is going to be used in a more targeted and more transactional manner, an investment of purchases no longer dressed up as a gift. The UK already merged its aid agency with its Foreign Office under Boris Johnson, whilst Marco Rubio made it clear that USAID will be used only where it directly serves US interests. You want aid? Then give us access to your minerals or take these deported migrants. So yes, it is clearly a popular political move, but only time will tell what the true cost will really be. What started out as being marketed as a poor financial decision that feels good actually ended up being a good financial decision that feels bad. Hey, quick thing. 91% of this channel's viewers in the last month were not subscribed. If this counts you and you enjoyed the content, then please hit the button. Shameless plug, but it does genuinely help out this new channel. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.